purpose in this life, both with God and with the people around me, with my family, and so it's had me this week in the Word and my personal studies, thinking what really is my purpose. So that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. And I don't really want to talk to you specifically about how to find God's purpose. We've had many sermons on that, and there's definitely going to be many more. But I don't want to specifically talk to you today about how to find God's purpose for your life, because we could be here all night. That's a whole nother sermon in itself. But what I want to talk to you about today specifically is more purpose in general, as a more holistic term. What is purpose, and in general, what is the purpose of having a purpose rather than your specific purpose, because that's something that I'll get into in the end, kind of a little tidbit of how you find God's purpose. But again, that's a whole nother sermon. So I want to talk more generally about purpose as a whole. And the world defines purpose on status, titles, income, oh, I'm a CEO, so that's my purpose. Or, oh, I'm a mother, so that's my purpose. These are all great things. But that's kind of things that the world defines. How much money do I make? Oh, I'm a millionaire, that's my purpose. Or, I'm saving the environment. When I was younger, that's, kind of how I wanted to define my purpose. I was like, I want to, I like this earth that God created for us, so I want to save the earth, and that's my purpose, or like I said, I'm a family man, I have a family, that's my purpose. Or I feed the homeless, that's my purpose. And these are all great things, but we have this church partner that I like to visit when I'm in Miami. It's called Boo, and they have this course, and it's not exclusive to them. They have it all over the earth, or all over the U.S. It's called Soul Care, and they basically do 7 different classes where they talk about really heart issues. They're doing care on the soul, so it's called Soul Care. But this one week they talk about what they call the lie of performance. And basically the lie of performance is basically my purpose is in what I can perform or what I can produce, or what I do. And that's basically what they call the lie of performance. And that's also not what I'm talking about today, but I just wanted to mention it. Our purpose, is not in what we can produce, what we can perform, the benefit that we give to other people, but it's in what God has for us. And I'm going to get into that now, but I just wanted to drop that tidbit. But people in the church do this too. They say your purpose is, oh, so do you volunteer at church? Okay, well, what's your position in the church, or how many acts of service you have. But that's not really your purpose that God has for you either. What God has for you is so much bigger than we can put in the words, and so much bigger than what people on the outside can put in. It's not about, what our position in the church is, how many volunteer hours we have, how many acts of service we have, what purpose we perform. And it's not necessarily often what we call ourselves either. And this isn't what I want to get into, and I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but people will say, oh, I'm a prophet, I'm a bishop, I'm an apostle, I'm this, I'm that, And that's not what I want to get into. That's a whole nother sermon. God has different callings for each of us. But our purpose is not what other people say about us, and it's not even really what we say about ourselves, but it's what God says about us. And that's what's the most important thing for our purpose. Now, what are some things that God has said about us? Well, generally, broadly speaking, he says this about all of us. He says we're children of God. We're sons and daughters. We're righteous. We're forgiven. We're healed. We're prospered. We're the head and not the tail. We're blessed. We're chosen. If any of you others probably have things that come to mind, these are things that God has said about us. And it's not what other people say about us or what other people view about us, or even things that we say about ourselves. Though I fully believe declarations are an incredible thing to do. I try to do my declarations every day, first thing in the morning. I declare things over my life. But I know God's purpose is not anything that I can change or declare. I'm not trying to declare a new purpose over my life. I'm just trying to speak the things that he has already spoken over me, over my life. But what is God's purpose over my life? And a good example of this is we're going to look at King David. And it's possibly the best example of this. And the first thing I want to say about King David is people love to judge King David, and people in general, they love to look at the end and say, okay, I can judge somebody by the end of their story, and that's how I evaluate them. Okay, at the end of their life, they reached this position, or they contributed this to society. You look at all the great inventors like Benjamin Franklin or Alexander Graham Bell, by the end of the story, even presidents of old, okay, well, this is what they produce, at the end of their life, now that they're passed away, we can let their work speak for themselves, the great artists who passed away, they don't become appreciated until after they're dead, but they look at their works as a whole and their whole life, and they kind of judge the end of the story and say, okay, this is what they accomplished at the end, and that was their purpose. So that's, how we kind of judge people. But how many of you guys know, God doesn't judge people's purpose based on the end. He prefers to judge people based on the beginning. He says in Jeremiah that I formed you in the womb before you were born, and I fashioned you in my purpose. He says that he gave Jeremiah a specific purpose even before he was born, and he's done the same with each and every one of us. So God didn't have a purpose for us at the end and say, okay, yes, we want to get to the end and say, well done, thou good and faithful servant, but it isn't what we figured out to do in our own strength at the end of our own life. Okay, we were faithful with this path that we've created for us in the framework. No, God has a specific purpose of what he wants for us to do in our lives, and it's not something that we need to figure out necessarily, but I'm getting away. So I'm going to go give you guys, this isn't just a rant, but this is, straight from the book. So I'm going to go to King David's purpose. So people look at King David from the end and you say, he was a warrior. He was a king over Israel. He killed Goliath. He killed the lion, the bear. They say, Saul killed his thousands and David killed his 10,000. So they look at the end of King David's story and they say, look at him. He was the ancestor of Jesus. He was, a mighty king over Israel. And these are all the things that people would say. David was, one of the greatest, yes, kings, but also one of the greatest biblical figures, possibly of all time, for these things that happened at the end of their life. But God didn't give David his purpose at the end or even in the middle. God didn't see David kill Goliath and say, okay, that man's going to be a good king for him. He didn't even see David get anointed and think, okay, let's see how this plays out. But God saw David when he was in the shepherd's fields tending the flock, and it's a very good picture for the rest of us as well, because our purpose isn't defined in what the world can see or proving ourselves in a job or proving ourselves in a position, but our purpose is defined in the little small things when we're faithful. The Bible says, he who is faithful with little shall be entrusted much. So when we're faithful with the little things, we then become entrusted with many things, and it's not when we get to the CEO position and then we prove ourselves, we've made it, and that's proving ourselves. But it's in the little things. It's just like with King David. It's when he's in the shepherd's field, he's tending to the flock, but he's worshiping God in that time. He's having a personal relationship with God, and he's proving himself just when no one's around. It's in the small things that he's proving himself. And in that same time where he's proving himself in the small things is when God gives him this purpose to be king, to be the ancestor of Jesus, to be all these different things. It's not yes, he does prove himself along the way, but God already had this purpose for him before, and he proved himself faithful not when he killed Goliath, not when he killed, thousands of armies of Philistines or anything like that. It was when he was in the shepherd's field keeping his flock. And I think that's a good picture for a lot of us, is you may think, once I get to that position, I'm really going to prove myself then. Or once I get promoted, I'll really prove myself then. Or once I get to this next phase or this next step, I'll be able to prove myself then. But David proved himself just when he was with the sheep. And you think, farmers, there's no one around. You're probably in a wide open field. You got sheep. What's around? How can you prove yourself faithful then? But he probably proved himself faithful by worshiping the Lord. And it says David had a heart after God. He had a heart after God's own heart. And like I said, people, it's really easy to find your purpose and measure yourself based on what people say about you or even what you say about yourself. But we look, and they say it about David. He was a king. He was a warrior. He was the ancestor of Jesus. But this is what God said about David. It said, he's a man after God's own heart. And that's what defined David's purpose more than anything else. More than being a psalmist. He wrote, most of the Psalms, incredible Psalms. He was a warrior, probably the greatest warrior, the greatest king. But these aren't things that really define. What defined David more than anything, most of all, was being a man after God's own heart. And, sorry, I lost track of my notes. I've kind of been going. We want to contrast this with Saul. Saul proved himself before men. But David proved himself before God. And that's a key.
Wow.
That's a key difference that we want to make, because a lot of times we'll see people in positions of power, looking at them, whether they're mighty businessmen or politicians, or even people that we'll see in positions of power at church. We'll say, look at them, wow, they're really elevated. What's going on with them? And so oftentimes we'll think, just because they're in a position of power, God must have put them and elevated them to that position. But that's not always the case. In this case, yes, God did elevate Saul, but he did so because of the griping of the people and because they kept clamoring and asking God for a king. And this didn't mean that Saul proved himself in any way. And I'm sure you guys will see a lot of this in your own personal lives, especially you're comparing with other business owners or other employees or other coworkers, and you're saying, why are they elevated to this position and I don't feel like they really deserved it? Meanwhile, I don't. And I want to get to that at the end of the sermon, but I just want to say, just because someone's elevated to a position doesn't necessarily mean that they've earned it or that God has put them in that position. Even so, when Jesus went into the desert to be tempted by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights, the devil says, look over, he takes him on a mountaintop, shows him the world, and says, look over, I will give this all to you if you bow down and worship me. So clearly the devil has power to elevate people to positions of power. And I think we'll all agree, no matter, what your opinions are on certain topics, you look around at the world today and you see clearly there's evil people who have been elevated to positions of power, and it wasn't God who's elevated them to these positions, but it was clearly the devil who's elevated them to this position to further his goal. But again, that's something I want to touch on in the end. But we go back to the picture of Saul versus David. David proved himself before God, and Saul proved himself before men. And the thing about proving yourself before men is it's never enough. It's never going to last. Whereas if you prove yourself before God, it's going to last. It's going to stand the test of time, not just in your own life, but for generations and generations to come. Now, the people were watching Saul on the throne, so everybody could see him. Everybody saw him walking the streets. He probably would go to the bazaars. It said he was one of the tallest men. He was probably really fit, really muscular, so he'd be walking around town, probably, probably a good looking guy, probably muscular, so he's walking around town. Everyone's looking at him, everyone's saying, now that's a man that should be king, that's a man who has what God is looking for, he should be our leader. Whereas David, I can't imagine there's many people out there in the shepherd's field, but if they are, they're not really people of influence. But David's out there proving himself before God, not in front of the sight of anybody, but just between him and the sheep, and God, and these simple things. But it says in 1 Samuel 16:7, and we all know this to be true, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. And I think that's the most important thing about David is it wasn't just that he took care of his sheep and protected them by killing the lion and killing the bear, or even killing Goliath, but it was on the heart on the inside of him. And that's something that you can't really learn how to fix your heart and have a heart after God's own heart. You can't really practice it or say, okay, you can't purchase something like that. The only way to be transformed is to spend continual time in the presence of God, continual time in His Word, giving Him permission. Sometimes I'll have to verbally say, Lord God, I give you permission to change my heart. Take my heart, make it mendable. I believe it's in Isaiah. He says, I'm going to take out your stony heart and give you a heart of flesh. And there's been many times where I feel like, Lord, I need you to take out my stony heart and give me a heart of flesh. And it's a continual renewal process. But it's clear that David had that soft, pliable heart, that mendable heart. We talked about Jeremiah earlier, but in Jeremiah he says, I want to make you like clay. You are clay in the potter's hands. I want to be able to break you down and mend you and mold you and shape you. And I think David, at his heart, was pliable to what God wanted to do in his life. And a large part of that, I think, was because he didn't have expectations. He didn't have plans. He didn't have goals. He didn't think too highly of himself. He said, I'm a shepherd, and I'm going to do this shepherd thing as best as I can. And God recognized, okay, you have a pliable heart, and you have a heart that I want to work with. I can elevate you to the position that I want to use you through. And of course, we all know that as he goes along in his life, he proves himself in each of these situations. That's 100% true. As you go through the steps and the stages, you do have to prove yourself in the positions that God places you, but the real beginning of your purpose, it's not when you get to that position. And David wasn't sitting around thinking, let me make a 10 or 20 year plan of how to become king, or how to become a great warrior, or how am I going to get out of this stupid shepherd's field, I'm here with these sheep. No, he is just being faithful to take care of the sheep, and God saw him from above when nobody else saw him and said, I see his heart, I see he's being faithful, all right, I'm going to raise him up. And I know it's a good picture for the rest of our lives because, and I have nothing against long-term plans, but I believe it's in Isaiah, the Lord says, my ways are higher than your ways, and our thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So I have to constantly remind myself, as much as I try to plan, as much as I try to schedule, there's no possible way that anything I could plan or schedule could ever compare to what God has for me in my life. So the best thing that we could do in this position is, and I do want to encourage you guys, if you don't know, God has a very specific plan that he has for your life. Whether it's business, I know Caleb is becoming a mighty man of business, whether it's in the ministry, whether it's acts of service or volunteering, feeding the homeless, those are all great things. But you want to look and see, okay, what is God's purpose for me? And it's not something that you can say, okay, this is my purpose, God, help me fulfill it. But you want to say, God, what is my purpose? And give me the heart to fulfill it and help me to know what it is and lead me on the way to fulfill it. And I think that's, kind of in the modern world today, it becomes, kind of one of the problems. Because I know when I was in college earlier, they say, go to college and figure out what you want to do with your life. But us as Christians, we need to encourage our children. And even if you're middle to late in life, my father likes to say, there's a verse, so God called him to the ministry at 50 years old. And there's a verse that says they call men from, I believe, 30 all the way up to 50. And no matter what stage you are in your life, I guarantee you that God's will for your life and your purpose is not completed. And it doesn't matter that, maybe you've missed it in the beginning part. Caleb loves to use this verse, but he said, God talks about redeeming the time. So even if you're 10 years behind, 20 years behind, 30 years behind of what God's purpose is for your life, God can redeem that time and give it all back and elevate you, accelerate you like a lightning speed to bring you up to everything that he has for you. There's no time lost, but I encourage you every day that you spend not seeking and wondering what is your purpose for my life and pursuing your own purpose, because I did this my own self. I went to college and I tried to study something that I thought was God's purpose for my life, and it took me years, even after graduating, to realize this is not what God had for me. And I would ask him, Lord, open this door for me. But I would always use the caveat, if this is what you have for me, So I'd apply to jobs, I'd get interviews, I'd say, God, if this is what you have for me, please let me get this job. And in my head, it was what he had for me. And then it took me until many years later that I realized that wasn't what God had for me. And now I look at it and I'm like, I don't have any semblance of wanting to do what I used to do and what did I try to plan out in my own life. And I look at my life now and I realize there is no possible way that I could have planned this to be where I'm at and to have done a better job and bring me everything. Even, and for those of you who are single, in pursuing my purpose that God had for my life, he brought me to Miami. And now in pursuing that purpose, I was able to find the future wife that he had for me. So all the things, we sing a song that Pastor Kevin and Gail love, and it's called Praise to the Lord, and that's most of the song is Praise to the Lord, the Almighty. But there's this one verse, and I love it. It says, "Hast thou not seen how all thy longings have been granted in what he ordained it?" And I feel like the wording is a little old timey, but it's such a good semblance, because you look at it and all the longings that we have, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in our business pursuits, whether it's in education or academia, or whether it's in acts of service, volunteering, feeding the homeless, or community service, or things of that nature. Anything that we long for and we want, God has already placed that thing and that purpose that he has divinely given us. And we can try to pursue and satisfy these things and attain these things in our own personal plan, But God knows He created us and He formed us. Every desire you have, every intention you have, everything that you think is particularly interesting, whether it's, I don't want to say astrology, astronomy, or, being an astronaut, or, sciences or engineering or mathematics or art or music, all these things, God created you uniquely and He wants you to use those purposes. But if you don't pursue Him as you try to pursue these things, you'll get to the end and you'll have attained these things and realize, I'm still empty, something's still missing, even though I thought this was the thing that I loved. I thought this was the thing that I wanted to pursue, but now I'm looking around, I have this thing and I still feel empty. It's because you're not fulfilling that exact purpose that God has for your life. We know, like I said, God's ways are higher than our ways, and His ways, our thoughts are not His thoughts. But the thing is, we think we have a semblance of what we want. And I've had this conversation, not even in spiritual settings, just in common conversations with people. I talk with them, and I design houses, and I said, I designed a house a couple years ago, and I thought, this would be so great to build, this is what I want to live in forever. And then years change, I get to the next season of my life and I realize the thing that I wanted in the last season is not even something that I want in this season. I want something completely different. And had I acted on that in that season, when it wasn't the time for me to act on it, I'd have this thing that I didn't really even want. It doesn't even really satisfy what I need for where I'm at. And the same thing can be said about everything that we want to pursue in our own personal lives. We may think, I know what I want to pursue, I know the steps that I want to take, but truly, we don't even know, the depths of our own desires at some point in time. We may think we do, we may know the surface levels, but God, the one who created us, He knows everything that we desire, and it's not, this and not this, but He made us desire this, and this, and this, and this. He made us desire music, He made us desire art, He made us desire, whether specific foods, if you want to be a chef. Everything that you're uniquely suited to desire, God has a specific purpose that will wrap this up in the most beautiful bow that you're not even, like I said, there's no possible way that you could plan or get to the satisfaction of what God has for your life by trying to plot it out on yourselves. You'll even realize, and I found in my own personal life as I followed these steps, there were things that I was interested in that I had never been exposed to, that I had no idea that I was interested in. And then you look at them and you follow God's purpose, and all of a sudden you're being exposed to these things and you're like, God, this isn't what I planned for my life, but I love this, and I don't know how I ever even got over to doing this, but only by your grace and the plan that you have for my life. And I've kind of digressed a little bit from all the notes that I've gotten down here, but I just really want to encourage you that everything that you desire, even, relationships, whether it's, a wife or, a husband or children, etc., every single thing that God has put on your, whether you're playing music or going to concerts or, I don't know, like fancy foods, like I said, anything that you have desired, God has already placed that on the inside of you, and He gave you those desires to begin with, and He wants you to use them and fulfill them for His purpose. And the best way to do that is to find His exact plan for your life, because I guarantee you, He has a purpose and a picture that summarizes everything else that you could possibly want, and there's no way that you could possibly be able to plan it other than by just listening, and sometimes it's being diligent. Like I said, we're not looking at, it's so easy to look at other people and say, why are they in that position? They could be doing so much more for their lives. Why are they there? Why are they still working for that person in that toxic situation? Why are they still in that toxic relationship? But at the end of the day, that's their life. And if it's God's purpose for their life and they've told them to stay there and be diligent, same thing with yourself. If you feel like I'm in a dead-end job, but God's telling me, stay here, be faithful, there's a point of proving yourself faithful. I have this young gentleman that we go to men's group with, and I had the privilege of sitting him down for lunch the other day, a couple weeks back, and we had some really good long conversations, but he said, I'm at this new company, and I'm trying to do everything that God has for me, and it's just not working off. I'm not seeing the success that I want to see in this new business, but I do feel like it's where God asked me to be, but I'm just not seeing the success. I'm tithing, I'm sowing, I'm going to church, I volunteer with him, we volunteer every Sunday, and he's like, I just don't know why it's not popping off. And he's only been there like 6 months. And I think there's definitely an element of proving yourself faithful and diligent in what God has given you. God needs to know that you're in it for the long haul, whether you see immediate success or not. And if you're just doing something because you think, oh, I can get a gospel and immediately I'm going to become rich and I don't need to worry about anything else. And if he knows, at the slightest chance of a struggle or the slightest chance of difficulty, you're going to walk away, then you're not proving yourself diligent. You're just proving that, you want whatever the easiest path of least resistance is. But there's a point of proving yourself faithful. And when I started doing what I'm doing now with business, I didn't make a bad living. But I've continued to, I was able to pay the bills. It wasn't anything extraordinary. But as I've continued to be faithful and diligent in the little things, there would be late nights where, I wouldn't get paid extra. And I'm not saying work late nights, don't get paid extra, to prove yourself. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is I knew that I needed to be diligent in what I was given because I was in the right place, I was in the right position, and you have to be diligent. And there's a series of growing, Maybe you'll start a new job and immediately God's going to say, this is your $1 million business, and then 6 months from now or a year from now, it's taken off. Maybe that'll be the case because God will know, you're going to be in it one way or another. But there's a lot of times there's going to be a chance, you have to prove yourself diligent and you have to continue to work at it, even in the difficult times, even in the struggles, because God wants to know he's not just in it for the quick success. He's in it because it's the purpose that I have for his life, and he's willing to go through the ups and downs because I've seen, my father being a businessman, basically all my life. There's ups and downs of no matter what business you're in, there's going to be ups and downs, and there's going to be difficult seasons. And if you just think 10 years, I'm going to have 10, 20, 30 years of, perfect success, and there's never going to be any difficulty in business. First of all, I'll say, anyone who has been in business or owns a business, they'll know that's just not the case. But the other side of it is if you don't learn how to persevere in those difficult seasons when it's early, then you get to the end when your business has been thriving for 10 or 20 years, and then you look around and you're like, I don't know what to do at this point because I've never had to persevere in these difficult seasons. God has never proven me and showed me how to overcome these challenges, and that I'm completely out of luck. So I think God likes to use those, especially early on when you're fulfilling your purpose. He's going to give you these difficult seasons to grow you, to show both that you can overcome, show you how to overcome, but he's also wants you to prove, okay, I'm in it to be faithful and diligent, no matter how difficult it is, I'm willing to put the work in. And I think that was the deal with my friend. And another thing he said is, I'm looking at, this guy, he's been there 8 years, and he's living with his girlfriend, and he's, kind of like a fake Christian. First of all, I want to say, if you're calling someone a fake Christian, it's just not a great mentality to start out with. God is doing a work in each and every one of us. He's taking us on a transformation, and not everyone starts at the same place, not everyone stays at the same place, but God is doing a transformation in every person's life, and as long as, if they're making an effort and moving that direction, that's the most important part. So you never want to get yourself in a position where you're looking at what someone else is doing and saying, hey, they're not walking rightly. Why is God blessing them, or they're, not the smartest person in the room. Why is God blessing them? I think that's something that the devil loves to work in people. He loves to say, look at that person's purpose. Your purpose should be like that. Why are they succeeding, and why are you not succeeding? And I think a lot of times the devil likes to have us look at other people's purpose and say, their purpose is my purpose. But like I said, we have no idea the perfect plan for our lives. Only God knows the purpose. And it's so hard with Instagram, all these different social medias to say, look at that person's purpose. I want that person's purpose to be my purpose. And maybe it is very similar, but if it's not, then you want to be very careful that you're not confusing someone else's purpose to be your purpose and wondering, why isn't it working off? But at the same time, this guy, like I was talking to my buddy, he said, this guy's been there 8 years, he's living in sin, but at the same time, God's blessing him miraculously. And I'm like, how long have you been there? He said 6 months. I'm like, well, for one, this guy's proven himself faithful. And even if God isn't in the picture, like I said, the devil will choose to elevate people for some reason or another, whether he's pursuing their purpose or whether he's just not attacking them because they're not a threat to his kingdom. Who knows? You really need to take a hard time examining someone's life to say, okay, why are they blessed and I'm not blessed? But at the same time, why would you spend time examining why someone's blessed and they're living in sin when you could say that, take that same time and examine your own personal life and wonder, okay, what's going on with me? Because I guarantee you, the longer you spend staring at someone else's life, you're going to start getting feelings and spirits on you that are not going to be beneficial. It's not just willful sin that can block you from everything that God has for you, but it's also these spiritual thoughts, spiritual warfare such as unforgiveness, resentment, judgment, all these things. Pastor Kevin likes to say they'll open you up not only to being hindered financially, but you'll even open yourself up to sickness. Unforgiveness, Pastor Kevin said, opened him up at this one point in time to a really bad bout of pneumonia, and he had no idea. All my life, he almost never gets sick, and it is honestly impressive, he almost never gets sick, but this one time, he had a really, really bad bout of pneumonia, and he was wondering, what's going on, I'm entitled to healing, I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, I'm walking in faith, and God told him that he had been walking in unforgiveness in a specific area of his life, and that allowed him the door to be open to healing, or to be open for his healing to be under attack. And the same thing can be happening in our finances where, okay, I'm tithing, I'm sowing, I'm working my butt off, and I'm not seeing it. But at the same time with this friend, it's clear that he had feelings of resentment towards coworkers, feelings of judgment, feelings of, who knows what, because he's comparing his purpose that God has for his life with the purpose that God has for someone else's life. And I just want to encourage you guys, why would you spend time thinking about someone else's purpose and losing sleep over why are they so successful and why am I not successful? Not only from the spiritual aspect of it, but also from the time aspect. Why would you spend time thinking about someone else's purpose when you could really just hone in on what is going on with my purpose? Because it's clear at the end of the day, it has absolutely nothing to do with their purpose has absolutely nothing to do with your purpose. Saul, and with this, back to the picture of Saul and King David, Saul had it out for David. So Saul was elevated to be king, but God chose David when Saul ended up proving himself not faithful. And, he probably chose David before the foundations of the earth with everything that we know. But back to it, Saul had become elevated to king and proved himself not faithful. So it didn't matter to God that Saul was already king. He had ordained David to be king. So the purpose of Saul really had almost, I don't want to say it had nothing to do, but it in no way negatively impacted the purpose of David. Because as we know on, as David ends up getting in the courthouse and he starts to get more claim, as people start to love David a little bit more, Saul actively begins to try to kill David and to try to remove him from the equation altogether because he recognized that David was a threat to his throne. And I just want to encourage you, it doesn't even matter, whether someone's in a position of authority over you, has it out for you, whether they want to fire you, whether they want to keep you down. As long as you're walking in the purpose of everything that God has for your life, there's nothing that's going to be able to hold you back from that. No human person. The only person that can hold you back from pursuing the plan and the purpose that God has for your life is yourself. And in this case, Saul is literally trying to kill. David's playing the harp, and Saul is chucking spears at him. I don't know if you've ever had a bad employer, but have you had someone literally throwing spears at you, trying to kill you, having just a manic episode all of a sudden, and then tries to kill you. And then you got to go back to work the next day, None of us have ever had a boss that bad, so, if David can get through that, and Saul's not able to hold back the purpose that God has for David's life, what more can a bad employer that you have in your personal life hold you back, or a bad relationship, or a family member? That's something else I wanted to talk on. When I was talking about defining our purpose. Again, we are only proving our purpose to God and no one else. We're not trying to prove our purpose to family members. We're not trying to prove our purpose to friends around us. And I feel like what limited time I spend on social media, which is still far more time than I should spend, I see, you'll see all kinds of things, and what I see, underlying a lot of the posts is, you know, people trying to prove themselves to the world around them, saying, oh, this is what I do, and this is what I accomplish, and this is what I benefit, and this is who I am, trying to prove themselves to the world around you. But we in the church know we don't need to prove ourselves to the world around us. We don't need to prove ourselves to our friends. Definitely not to our family, especially if you come from a toxic situation. I'm blessed from the family situation that I have, but I know some friends who come from family situations where nothing's ever good enough for their family members. They can never prove themselves, whether in their parents' eyes or their siblings' eyes. And I just want to encourage you guys that you're not proving yourself to your family members. You're not proving yourself to your friends, no matter how close you hold them dear. At the end of the day, the only person you need to prove yourself to is God. And another thing I wanted to say is, I'll be very gentle with this, but really, at the end of the day, you're not trying to prove yourself to your spouse either. And I've seen that in marriages. It's really difficult where you're trying to, as the man, you're trying to be the provider for, your wife, and you feel like I need to provide for my wife. I need to prove myself that I'm the man that she chose to marry. And it becomes very difficult because, yes, God does want you to be a provider, but I think that's why it's really key that if you're in a relationship and you're pursuing God, you both need to be pursuing God together so that you're both well aware of the purpose that God has for both of your lives. And once you get married, it's not just a singular purpose, but you then become having a joint purpose. And if you guys are not both in line, we have this gentleman who, great friend, he started going to Bible college recently. And him and his wife are both believers, and he told us, it's really encouraging, he said, I had to sit down with my wife and say, look, God is calling me to Bible school and to be a minister, and I want you to know that this is going to be a really difficult season for both of us because I'm not really going to be getting paid from going to this Bible school. I'm not going to be able to make as much money as I wanted to be. And if his wife was not in agreement with him and recognized, yes, I agree that this is what God has for you, and I recognize that this is going to be difficult, then, it's not going to be very long before she's the breadwinner and he's over here pursuing this ministry thing, and there starts to become resentment formed up because he's pursuing this path. So I want to encourage you, those of you who are married, I'm about to get married, so I don't like to speak on marriage too much, because I'll experience it more as I get there. But I do want to encourage you that if you're in a marriage or even in a really committed long-term relationship, that if you're pursuing God, you want your partner to be pursuing God, and then you want to join that pursuit of God together, because your purpose that God has for you and your purpose that God has for your partner, it's going to combine together. And if you are at odds and you know that God has a purpose for your life and it tells you to do some crazy things, and your spouse doesn't see this purpose and doesn't trust you that you have this purpose that God has for you, it's not going to end up well, because before long there's going to be a resentment because they're not going to understand the choices that you're making. They're not going to understand, why aren't you doing this? This is so simple. Just do this. Just work this stupid job, Just put food on the table when God has something that He's calling you to do that doesn't make sense. And there's so many times in the Bible where God asks people, the higher of the calling that God has for you, the least it's going to make sense. We look at Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. God told Joshua to walk around the walls of Jericho for 7 days. 7 days straight. Like, that doesn't make sense, And the people were probably like, what are we doing, Like, after probably, the first day they're probably like, this is a little weird, but whatever, Josh said to do it. Second day they're like, we're out here again, walking around this wall, doesn't make any sense. It's probably around day 5 or day 6, they're probably like, what are we doing? Why are we walking around this stupid wall, But then day 7 comes, and if Joshua at any point was listening to anyone else other than God for His purpose, then the words of the people probably could have come in and he kind of started getting the doubt and saying, was this really what God told me to do? And I want to encourage you guys, the devil will try to get, I know I'm going a little long here, I'm going on tangents, but I want to encourage you guys, the devil will try to use anything you can to dissuade you from the purpose that God has for your life. And that one of the main ways is doubt. And he'll say, is that really what God told you to do? This is crazy. There's a better way for you to do it. God, you may think God told you to do this, but God actually told you to do this, or maybe that wasn't God altogether. And I've heard stories and stories and stories of people who say, I thought God had told me to do this, but I didn't act on it, and now I'm not really so sure that that's what God had for me. I want to encourage you, it's really important that you're able to hear and commune with God, that when He gives you a purpose for your life, that you walk on it, and you know, this is what God has for me, and I'm going to walk it out, because once that seed of doubt becomes in, there's that Bible verse that says, when you've done all, stand. But it's going to be a whole lot harder to stand if you don't have confidence in what you're standing for. If you know this is God's purpose and He has blessings for me, and I just need to hold out, and without a shadow of doubt, then you're going to be able to stand a lot longer than someone who's saying, I've been working and I'm not making men's meat, and I think this is what God has for me, but it's just really difficult and I'm just not really sure anymore. You're not going to be able to stand nearly as long as a person who says, you know what, things may be difficult, but I know this is what God has for me, and He has good things for me, good things stored up, so I'm just going to continue to persevere and continue to push through. And if you're fully convinced that this is what God has for you, and it ends up not being, God will give you that nudge to shift you along in the right direction. God is faithful, and He prefers someone to be hot or cold rather than someone to be lukewarm. And if you're someone who said, I think this is God's purpose, so I'm going to kind of try to pursue it, but you're just not really fully committed, that means, you're not committed to the plan that God has for your life. And God, God says, if you're neither hot nor cold, I want to spit you out of my mouth. At least if you're hot, but you're in the wrong direction, He can reposition you to what He has you for. So if you're fully committed to, and you simply make a mistake, and you're like, I believe this is what God has for my life, and you fully, in the integrity of your heart and your mind, say, I believe this is what God has for my life, and you got it a little bit off, God is fully able to course correct you and bring you over, because He recognizes, He's going to respect, okay, this man, maybe he misheard a little bit, but he's committed to doing what God has for my life, what I've made for his life. And maybe he got a little bit off, but he's in the integrity of his heart. He's pursuing me. I'm gonna speak to him, and I'm gonna give him a little bit of shift. I'm gonna open the right doors for him to lead him on that path. This was a verse that I was gonna write down. So I initially was gonna talk about this, and then it ended up changing. But the verse in the Psalms, I'm actually gonna pull it up. I believe I wrote it down, but. It's in the Psalms, and he says, it's David, he says, the Lord has enlarged my steps under me. And I love this verse so much because initially when I consider this, this verse, it's obviously talking about slipping and falling. If you're slipping, but you take a misstep basically, and you fail. And we all know King David, powerful man of God, but he had plenty of missteps and he had plenty of mistakes. But I love this verse that he wrote. He says, the Lord has enlarged my steps under me. Like, how many of you guys, I don't know if you've ever been up and down the stairs and you've slipped or missed a step or something like that. If you haven't, good for you. It happens to me more often than I like to admit. But imagine, you make a misstep, and I love the picture that literally, you're going to slip, and God could literally increase the step on you. And I know that's maybe not exactly what David's saying, but I like to use this because it's such a good parallel that literally we're walking through life, we're on the steps of life, we're climbing taller and taller to what God has for us. And then we start to do a little slip. We start to make a misstep, and God will literally increase, the steps under us, because He's a God of mercy. He recognizes no one's perfect. All have fallen short. Sometimes we miss it. Sometimes we get off track. But God, if we're in the integrity of our heart, fully pursuing God and the purpose that He has for our lives, He's willing to give us a little bit of grace in those, okay, I miss it. He's not going to let us fall all the way back down those steps. He's going to enlarge the steps under us so that maybe we should have deserved to fall in that situation. I know there are many times in my youth where I deserved to be in a lot worse situation than I ended up being. I don't like to be one of those people who get out there and they love to talk about the sin that God saved them from. Like, oh, if only you knew my old life. And they'll spend 20 minutes talking about how bad their old life is, and then say, oh, but God is good, He saved me from all that, and then, so I don't like to glorify, but I will just say, there were so many situations that could have ended up a whole lot worse for me, but I truly believe God enlarged my steps under me to save me from those situations that I really, at that point in my life, I didn't deserve to be saved from that situation at all. It was truly only the mercy of God. And yes, I was going to church at the time, but I was not fully committed to pursuing the plan that God had for my life. But I truly believed He enlarged my steps in so many situations that really should have ended up a whole lot worse for me. And I'm so thankful to God for that. But I bring that situation up, or I bring that scripture up because there's also the picture, now that I'm thinking about it, where yes, He can enlarge the steps under you straight, but He can also enlarge the steps under you, if you're going off to the side, and allow you to reposition you back onto the right track. And that had nothing to do with what I was going to talk about, but it kind of came in my spirit, and I just wanted to share that with you. I have no idea what time I started. I think I'm running a little long, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. But I want to close with this. I was talking about I just want to reiterate, if you're looking at other people in your life and I'm saying, why are they succeeding when they're living in sin? Why are they having such, why is God touching them? When I know for a fact, and they're being vulnerable with you. They're saying, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm struggling with this. And you take that same information and go home and start judging them off of that. That's definitely a you problem. And there's not really from anything specific in my own personal life. I just, I've seen it play out a handful of times where someone, is vulnerable with their struggles, and then, someone else, from church says, well, they're struggling with this, and God's still blessing them this way, and God's still putting them in this position. I just want to encourage you guys, it's a very dangerous place to be. The Bible says, judge others not, that you be not judged, and sin is sin, if they're living in sin, whether it's adultery or, who knows, addiction or anything else like that, it's sin. There's no, sin is sin, there's no, I don't know if there's a hierarchy of sin, but at the end of the day, sin is sin, and you're in just as much sin for judging somebody from that position as they are in, and even more so possibly because, physical sin, we're not even going to get there, but I just want to encourage you guys, don't allow yourselves to be dissuaded by feelings of resentment, by looking at someone who's in a different purpose and a different path that God has for you and saying, why are they succeeding in their purpose when I'm not succeeding in this similar purpose that happens to be very similar. Maybe you're in the same line of work from somebody and everything's clicking for them and it's just not clicking for you. Or maybe, you live in the same city or you live in the same building or, you're in the same line of work or even the same company and you're saying, look, I'm doing everything they're doing. I'm a believer. It's clicking for them. Why isn't it clicking for me? I just want to encourage you guys that the purpose that God has for you is so independent from everything that God, has for somebody else. Maybe He needs to grow you in a season for one reason or another. Maybe it isn't even what God has for you at all. That's what I encouraged, my buddy, and maybe God truly is blessing him in this person, but you want to make sure in this field, but you want to make sure 100%, 1,000% absolutely that just because someone's successful doing this business doesn't mean you should jump over it because that might not be what God has for you. And you want to know 1,000%, this is what God has for me. And then even if it is the exact same thing that God has for somebody else, the timing 100% can be different, because God wants to grow you in different areas before He takes you to the next level. Each season He has for you, He has to grow you in a specific area. So maybe this person is already developed in patience. Maybe this person is already developed in determination and overcoming obstacles, whereas you're not. So God needs to take a little bit of extra time and work on you in overcoming these obstacles. But just to recap everything, because I know I've been a little bit all over the place, but God has a specific purpose and a calling for you. It has nothing to do with anyone else, whether it's coworkers, someone in the same field as you, or what you see on the internet, which it's so easy now to try to compare yourselves with everything you see on the internet. But I also want to encourage you guys, you don't need to prove yourself if you know where you're at, and this is what God has for me, and it doesn't look glamorous on the outside. David was literally in the shepherd's field tending sheep, one of the, not one of the least glamorous jobs you could probably think about. But he wasn't out there trying to prove himself to anything. And I know in my personal life, sometimes it's really easy when you're talking to people and they say, "What are you doing now?" And you kind of downplay what you're doing as it's not like, not that you're not proud of it, but you don't want to make it out to be something like, even myself, I'll say, I'm doing building plans, and I'll say like, oh, I'm doing building plans, but I'm not licensed, or I'm doing this for now, but I'm working towards something else, and we downplay, the position that God has put us in. And I just want to encourage you, you don't need to prove yourself or downplay the position that God has put you in based on someone else's expectations. We need to be fully confident in what God has for us. And the fact of the matter is there's always going to be somebody who's not impressed. There's always going to be someone who might even be offended with what you're choosing to doing or think, okay, you could have been doing something else. Or there's always going to be someone that has advice over your life. And the only person whose advice that you really need to be taking is from the Lord Most High. He's the only person that has a perfect plan over your life. He's the only person that can see all the different possibilities, mistakes, perfect outworkings. This thing we call life, 100 years, I'd like to say I'll be blessed to get it. The choices that I'll make in the 80 to the 100 years of my life, there's going to be millions. There's going to be millions of opportunities for missteps and mistakes. No one can possibly plan or foresee the future, how this country is going to go, or with international relations, who's going to be president 5, 10, 20 years from now. No one can possibly see all these potential variables. And last thing I'm going to say, a little tidbit, I know I'm closing, but when I started going back to school, the hot topic was computer science, and there were all these tech jobs, hundreds of thousands of dollars, Google's hiring, Apple's hiring, and everyone's like, computer science, coding, this is the hot field. You want to get into this, because you're going to make some serious money and nothing's going to compare. And we look, that was maybe only a short 4 or 5 years ago. And just like that, 5 years later, this AI thing is coming out, and all of a sudden, that is one of the, it's still high paid if you can get a job, but it is like one of the highest unemployment rates for recent graduates. And if you would have gone based on, oh, this is, what I think is going to be the future, this is where I'm going to make some good money, and you try to plan it out, you can get 4 or 5 years down the road and realize the whole world has shifted, and I was planning for a world that has completely changed. I was planning for a world of yesterday that no longer even completely exists. So I say all that to say, and I just, a little tidbit, if any of you are in computer science and God has called you to do that, He's fully capable of blessing you. There could be 9 out of 10 people unemployed, and you could be that one employed person. So it doesn't matter how difficult the season is if God has called you to be in a particular situation. But I say that to say, the only person, we can try to plot out 5, 10, 20 years down the road for, what I think is going to be the perfect future and where I want to be. But the only person who can take all the variables into account, past, present, and even the future variables into account and say, this person, this purpose, I'm going to have Michael, or I'm going to have Caleb, or I'm going to have Chase 5 or 10 years from now, uniquely positioned for this perfect purpose that I have, that there's no possible way that he could plan it, but I'm going to start setting the wheels in motion to put Chase where I need him to be 10 years from now. And if we try to plan that, we're never going to get there. But if we just get into the flow of God, the will of God, Joseph, sorry, I know I keep throwing in other things, but Joseph, no one knew a famine was going to come to Egypt for 7 years. But God uniquely put Joseph there. Easily, it was probably, 10 years ahead of when this famine was going to come, because God uniquely was like, I have a purpose for Joseph. It's not just for the saving of the people in Egypt, but during that time, a lot of the Jewish people, which at this time, was still basically more just almost a really large family at this point in time. But God knew I need to provide for my people, and there's a season of famine that's coming that no one knows is coming, and no one knows how to prepare for. But God positioned Joseph 10 years in advance for this famine, and he did it by throwing him into slavery and to jail. So if you ever think, this isn't my purpose, God doesn't have this for me, you just never know. God brought Joseph to slavery and jail to 10 years later be able to provide not just for his family, but food for an entire population. So I just want to encourage you guys, we can't know what the next 10, 20, 30 years, the people in this room right now, we're still young, we got probably at least another 40 years of business, we can't foresee what the next 40 years has looked like, because the past 40 years have just been, absolutely insane, I imagine. So I can't even begin to fathom what the world's going to look like 40 years from now. But God already knows. And God's going to uniquely put us in a business that's going to provide for us today, tomorrow, and if He has for us to shift, He'll have for us to shift. But I just want to encourage you guys to get in the flow, find out the exact purpose that God has for your life. And the only way you're going to do that, it's not going to be proving yourself once you get in a specific position, or once you get a specific degree, or once you graduate, or once you get that specific job, but it's only going to be proving yourself faithful, both, yes, in the shepherd's field, and again, this is another a message for another day, but to find God's will for your life, I just want to encourage you guys, the way you're going to do that, it's going to be in the prayer room, and that's a whole nother, sermon for another day, but I just want to encourage you guys, find God's purpose for your life. It's nothing to do with anybody else's. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. You don't have to sit and plan and plot, how am I going to get 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road? God already has all that mapped out. Just get in the flow, And David, he found that purpose not by planning, not by plotting, not by being in the right place at the right time. He simply did it by being a man after God's own heart. So I want to encourage you, men, most of all, most importantly, be a man after God's own heart, and everything else will fall into place. Because if you're a man after God's own heart, you're going to love God. You're already going to be diligent. God didn't tell David, you better be good in this position or you're not going to be a good king. No, he already had the heart to take the most of the opportunities that God had for him. So I encourage you guys, be a man after God's own heart. Thank you so much. I know I didn't have a timer. At some churches they have a timer. So maybe next time I preach, they'll put a little timer for me so that I'll know I need to wrap it up. But I appreciate the opportunity that my parents, Pastor Kevin and Gail, have given me to preach today. And I appreciate you guys who stuck with me in person today. It's really great. It's kind of like we have our Tuesday night men's meeting, so it's kind of like, I see some of the same faces, that I'll see there. So it's just kind of like a continuation of that. But for those of you online, I appreciate you. I hope the quality was good, the sound quality, and I know the word quality was good. No, I know I hope the video and sound quality was good. But I thank you for listening, and I know Pastor Kevin and Gail will be back Wednesday night. But God bless as you go through this week.